Hey, what's up, you guys? My name is Cybersnowolf, and for this episode, we are doing a continuation on the God of War Ragnarok project. This time, doing a solo showcase revolving around the World Serpent Jörmungandr. So, this video is actually pre-recorded and recorded before this. So by the time you're seeing this video, the Ragnarok project will have already been released, and we'll have done the full showcase on the minifigures and the diorama. But this video is exclusively following along the buildable figure for Jörmungandr. And the reason being is that by the time you see this video, Jörmungandr will have already been glued and permanently put in place for the project itself. And since I put so much work and detailing into this figure, I figured that the best approach for him would be a separate showcase all on his own. So this video will be entirely revolving around just for him, where I go into further detailing to how I sculpted him, why I basically just went with this, and overall just sort of treat this as like a solo showcase. So without further ado, let's get started. So as you can see, the overall figure for Jörmungandr is really massive. I have to use the original theater box that I've been using for years for previous showcases. Just to display this guy. His overall length, combined with the head and tail, is 5'10". Without them, it's around 5'5" or 5'6". 5'6". It's the biggest and longest buildable figure I have ever made, and honestly, the hardest one that I've done because of how I approach this, which I'll explain as we go further along. So, primarily, this thing is built up in 4 different pieces. We have the head, the tail, the shell plating, and the connector piece. The tail was the easiest part as it's not counting the scaling that I have on this thing with the air clay. Underneath, it's just a regular tail that I had from previous sets from years ago. I just took the tail piece, and super glued it at the end piece, at the last connector piece down at the bottom to call it good. The head piece, I used a spare dragon head from like the old Ninjago dragon sets from the early years, like an extra golden dragon head, I believe was what it was. It was a good shape overall for Jörmungandr, and I felt it was like a good shape to like work off of. So some of the stuff that I did was I first like set it off the top a little bit to sort of like smooth it up. I removed the original teeth completely on both the lower and upper jaws, and then sculpted in my own teeth. These are probably some of the best teeth that I've done because it made it easier to sculpt these teeth for a bigger piece compared to smaller stuff. But it came out pretty good. I removed the beard part from this thing, sanded up a bit, and then sculpted in the seaweed beard for Yormi. For the hollow parts of this build, I filled them in with clay, and also made sure to cut up some pieces a bit so that way they don't stick out a bit. And then once it was all filled in, it came out pretty good. Like you can also see that the filling in comes in at the back here, as well. I pretty much just filled in as much of the gaps as I could, which turned out pretty good. For the face, for like the face build, I sculpted around the face a bit, and made sure to leave the eyes alone at first before like going back in and filling them in with clay. But I first like sculpted out a bit, and then also used this imprint piece that I got from Etsy. Like it's a really useful piece. Like, as you can see, this thing is like snake scales, and in fact that's what this thing was described as, for snake and dragon scales. So I just used this and just basically imprinted as many scales as I could around this thing, and it turned out pretty good. And again, so it still like represents like the snake scaling for him. I sculpted in like his eyes afterwards. Like at first I left them alone, and then filled them in the gaps. And I'm really glad I did that. Like I left them alone through the whole process. That way it made it easier to know like how far apart these eyes are, and that way I could like just sculpt them in, and not have to worry about one being like too bigger than the other one, or them both being off angled a bit. They're at the same length, and it turned out pretty good. For the paintwork overall for him was pretty interesting. Like I did 2 base paints first. Like for the upper layer, I did an ocean breeze, as it was the closest to match up with Jörmungandr's color scheme in the game. Underneath, I actually used 2 different colors. Like I first did like this sand green, I think is what it was called, and then I went back and did like, I think it was like a grass green, but it was the same green paint that I used for the Doomslayer Mark II minifigure. figure, which turned out pretty good. And good. I used a forest green for the seaweed, and for the seaweed bits underneath, which turned out good. Good. And for the rest of the paintwork, and we're just filled it in with, with like a muscly flesh color, on pink for the inside of his mouth. I did maroon for his red markings. I painted in like orange for his eyes. I drew in the pupil, and then like did some yellow to complete up with the iris, which turned out really great. Really great. Like, I really like how the head turned out, and it was probably where the most detailing went. With everything else, though, it was quite the process to do. So why I said this thing was the hardest one is when overall approaching Jörmungandr, the biggest problem I had was how long did I have to build this thing, and how many pieces would it take to really put this thing together. I knew the pieces that I wanted to use. That I wanted to use this connector piece, and this style connector piece, and this shell plating kind of piece, because that way it's a good enough length that multiples of these would really help out, and this is a good enough length that once it's added on with replicants of it, it provides articulation and enough movement, so that way once this thing is in the diorama, it can wrap around and fully be completed. But the problem was that I don't know what these kinds of pieces are called, like in the buildable figures. I didn't know what these pieces were called, and I didn't know how many I would need. I didn't want to like just buy a bunch of buildable figures and then like just scrounge around for this particular piece while selling, while like having the rest off in like a bin or something not being used. So to help out with this, I reached out to Titan King, commissioned him, and I'm like, hey, can you make me like these kinds of pieces? And he helped out really great. And he did a really amazing job with this, as well as the same thing with the shell plating. Like the pieces turned out good, and there was a lot of experimentation with this. That I basically just printed these off in like packs of 12, and then just sort of eyeballed on how many it would take. So with that in mind, the overall piece together, not counting the head and the tail, it is made up about 49 of these pieces. That's how many it took. That's how many of these it took to make this. There were a lot of misprints and a lot of stuff broke apart, but overall, in the final results, it turned out good, which was so worth it in the end. And with the shell plating, it was originally just gonna leave it off as sort of like this piece, like I was just gonna leave it at that. But the more I thought about it, the more I decided to just add like a finishing touch to him. So what I did was I basically took some clay and then sculpted on top of the piece, Then using this imprint piece, I basically just sort of wrapped it around each of the pieces one by one, and imprinted as many scales as I could on each of them. This took a long process to do with the overall process, and there were a lot of mess ups here and there. But by the final results, like each of them are fully scaled up, and it turned out really great. And as you can see, like he does have articulation around here, and it's not quite as solid as like official Lego, but many of the parts like stay in enough to where he can move up and around, and it still pose off, and it'd be really great. It's really cool. So while we have this guy up here, I can show you underneath his underbelly. You could actually see like some more detailing on the scales underneath, because I had to go back through the game to double check. I'll check out some stuff, and there is some scaling in the underbelly. Like it's not as evident as the scales themselves, since it's mostly covered up. But since it was there, I figured we could go ahead and wrap it up. It probably was a failed. It was like a waste of time in hindsight. And so considering once this thing is in the diorama, I'm gonna have to glue it in place. But I really wanted to go the extra mile and give it off like the full detailing as much as possible with this thing. It did result in more work, and I did have to do and there was a lot of trial and error of getting it together. But once it was finished, this turned out amazing. I was really happy with this thing. And it was definitely one of the biggest challenges I've had with a buildable figure figure, but so worth it in the end. And that's going to do it for this solo showcase on Jörmungandr, and that concludes it overall for the God of War Ragnarok project. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Now, as you can see, this is just a quick clip on the full display for Jörmungandr. You can definitely see that he fits up in the entirety of the diorama. And as I said before, this was a really hard challenge to tackle on, mostly because I had no idea initially how to approach for Jörmungandr. I didn't have a solid plan, especially compared to some of the other builds that I've done. But at the end of the day, I'm so satisfied with how he turned out, and I love the end results of it. I think he looks so cool, looks so amazing. And I definitely hope to try again with something like this in the future. Probably not quite as extreme, but just the creativity behind it would so be worth it. But overall, that is going to be it, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time in the next video.